Welcome to another video. You've heard the saying, the best trick the devil ever pulled was to convince the world that he didn't exist. In this video, we're going to be talking about another trick of the kingdom of darkness, counterfeit righteousness. It's used to create a false dichotomy, and I've seen a lot of people get hung up on these things. It causes a lot of arguments. It goes into theology and soteriology. You may have heard of a term called common grace. All right. They have common grace or prevenient grace. And when you get into systematic theology, you have the effectual calling or the general call. But when you're dealing with grace, the common grace is supposedly a way to explain how mankind, apart from faith in Christ or believing God, can still do things that are considered good or righteous. There was a gentleman I used to know, and I used to talk about my faith in Christ around him, and it annoyed him a little bit. And I used to get a lot of questions. He would try to stump me. He would try to throw little, straw man arguments at me, and I would be tested in this and tested that. One day, he called me up on the phone, and he said, yeah, there was something I was going to ask you. He said, I know you believe in Jesus and everything, and I know, Christians are supposed to be good and all that, but, I had this neighbor. And he went along and he explained how one of his neighbors was such a wonderful person, most generous guy he's ever met. But he was kind of into New Age and reincarnation and all this. In fact, the story that he told me involved he was out pulling some weeds or something like that under a camper trailer. And his neighbor came over and told him not to do it, or asked him if he would stop doing it. And evidently he believed that, these plants were kind of his ancestors or something, and the reincarnation kind of stuff where you transcend or I guess transition into some other type of thing, whether it be an animal or a plant or whatever. And so the guy gave him $500 to let the weeds grow under his camper. Of course, then he proceeded to tell me of all the wonderful things his neighbor was involved in, and how generous and loving he was and moral and all these things. And then, of course, he threw the question at me, how is it possible that he is good or is righteous and doesn't believe in Christ, right? And I've heard this thrown at a preacher before. And the preacher, he got the same spiel about a guy who was, generous, opened the door for everybody, always helped the old ladies across the street, and, would give the shirt off his back to anybody who asked, and all these things, right? And the preacher said, well, his daddy must have read the Bible. Okay. And so somehow that righteousness had gone down through his lineage. And that was his explanation. But I don't think that works. Okay. Because the devil is very clever. Okay. And you see that in a lot of, maybe even in a cult, you'll see a type of righteousness. You'll see people who are very moral. The Mormons, for example, they believe that God was once a man and that he transcended into being the Elohim, right? They believe a lot of things, okay, that aren't biblical. Okay, are they moral people? Yes, they are. They are very zealous about evangelizing people. They don't drink. In fact, you can't even buy lottery tickets in the state of Utah. I think there's over 90% of Salt Lake City that's Mormon and well over 80% of Provo. But, getting back to the point, they're very moral people. They're good people. Glenn Beck mentioned that. I think he's a Mormon. And I think the reason that he went with Mormonism had to do with a type of virtuous, moralistic viewpoint, not necessarily, scriptural authority. Okay, so what's the answer? Well, it's counterfeit. That's a way to deceive people into believing that Christianity is just another religion, or there's righteousness apart from Christ. How does that work? Is there a righteousness apart from Christ? Or maybe even to make Christians look like hypocrites, because in this world, Christians are going to get persecuted by the devil. They're going to get harassed. Unbelievers aren't going to be dealing with the same level of temptation and pressure. Psalm 34:19, many are the afflictions of the righteous. Christians are going to be experiencing fiery trials. Believers are going to be hit harder than unbelievers. The world is going to be confused with that. They are going to be drawn into that false dichotomy. They are going to be thrown into that straw man argument. Well, there's plenty of good people that aren't Christian, right? Because the whole focus, of course, for a lot of evangelism is, are you breaking the commandments? The whole conversation swings towards morality, and you have the opportunity for lateral comparison. Do you believe that you deserve to go to hell? There's going to be a judgment and all that. People are always going to have the temptation to go into lateral comparisons at that point, and they need to understand the purpose of the law and how it relates to the gospel. The law is a schoolmaster to drive people to Christ. Understanding how we're going to be compared to the perfect requirement of the law, and no one will be justified in and of their own works, right? When you get into Romans chapter 3, all throats are open graves, all tongues practice deceit. No one is righteous, no, not one, no one who seeks God. And what's the point? Is that talking about total inability? No. Is it talking about the fact that no one could do anything good? No. It's talking about people being justified under the perfect standard of God's righteousness, right? And no one is able to fulfill the law perfectly, because if you mess up once, well, you're guilty of the whole law, right? And it displays a fundamental reality, and that is the schoolmaster that drives people to Christ. And one of the problems that the Jews had was that they were comparing their righteousness to the righteousness of the nations or the Gentiles. And that's not going to work, because we are not going to be compared to each other on Judgment Day, right? You're not going to be compared to the people who are getting drunk at the bars, or the people who are involved in prostitution or gross immorality, right? That's not going to be the standard. You're not going to be put on the scale and compared to a group of your peers. You are going to be judged according to the perfect, spotless, righteous standard of God's perfect law. Okay, and the only one who was able to do that was Christ. 2 Timothy 3 talks about having a form of godliness, but denying the power thereof. And that's the power of the gospel, the power of faith in Christ, of believing the truth, that no one is going to be justified by their own works, and that there is no righteousness apart from Christ, period. And that's the truth. The Bible talks about people loving the truth, or how the truth will set you free. If you believe that you can have righteousness apart from Christ, you are believing a lie. If you are looking around and doing lateral comparisons and trying to find out whether you're righteous, you're deceived. Everyone is guilty, and we all need to be in Christ. We need to be born again. We need to be grafted into the vine that is Christ, and we will bear much fruit. Any other kind of righteousness is a counterfeit righteousness, and it certainly doesn't meet God's standards. Don't be deceived and get drawn into the murky waters of this straw man argument. Thanks for watching.